Well, welcome, Kelly, to the Happier at Work podcast. I'm delighted to have you here. Would you like to introduce yourself to listeners?
Yes, I'm Dr. Kelly Monahan, and I lead Accenture's global talent and organization research agenda across the company.
Wow. I mean, that sounds so interesting in itself. And before, like, we're here today to talk about the future of work. Before we get started on that, I'd love to know, like, what has changed for you? What's kind of going on a day-to-day basis? What does a day in the life, a week in the life look like for you at the moment?
Yeah, I would say there's been two pretty profound changes. So, at Accenture, we've been mobilized to work remote for a while now. So, when the difference is though, I was either on the road about 50 to 60% of the time or working from home. So, the lack of travel has been a big difference for my day to day. Usually, I was meeting with clients in person or our leadership teams, running in person interviews and focus groups with C suite executives. And so not being able to do that in person has definitely been a pretty big difference. Not having that variety either of going to different cities and absorbing different cultures. I was actually supposed to be in Ireland, in Dublin, in April, and then going
Oh,
on to London. So it was a bummer to have missed those opportunities. And obviously, I'm hopeful those will get rescheduled in next year. And then the second thing is actually I've never been busier. So, because this is what we're considering a human capital crisis,
yeah.
people are at risk, safety, and the questions people are asking at first, it was a sense of urgency to move to technology platforms to enable remote work. And again, in particular, knowledge industries where that could happen. And now it's all about the people element. How do we lead remotely? How do we make sure our managers are equipped to maintain productivity and keep their workforce sustainable? As we think about moving the workforce back into physical locations, what are those safety metrics we got to think through to make sure that happens? So we've never been doing more research than we have right now, trying to bring data and empirical evidence to these conversations, hopefully
Yeah.
so leaders can make better decisions.
Wow. And then kind of generally speaking, going to the shops or the store what does that look like? Or, what kind of impact has that had on your kind of daily life?
Yeah, so I live right outside Philadelphia, and we're still considered, here in the States, we have all different coding and colors depending on where you live and whether or not COVID has seen a decline. So I kind of live in a pretty red area, it's considered. We're about an hour and a half outside of New York and about 20 minutes outside of Philadelphia. So a lot of big population, urban population. So right now we are still under more of a lockdown mentality. So it's going on almost day 70 now for us. So, if we do leave the house, it's got to have mask. Anytime we go into a grocery store, they've been very clever and responded pretty quickly. It's all one way, like how you even move throughout the grocery
Oh,
store.
wow. Now that's a
Um,
good idea.
yeah, so the coordination has been wonderful. All of our restaurants and bars and everything are shut down. So, but some restaurants have figured out how to get into digital platforms and
Yeah.
order online
Similar
and
here. Yeah.
deliver. Yeah, but it's definitely does not feel normal going outside these days, and it's amazing how complicated everything becomes just trying to get your groceries. Or I decided to paint my house, to kind of keep me, active, and just even trying to figure out how do you get paint supplies and paint during this time has been pretty exhausting, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's similar here. The one-way system sounds amazing. We definitely don't have that. And I know, like, for me, going to the supermarket is actually quite scary because people
Yes.
get quite close. We don't have that one-way system. I mean, that sounds ideal because at least it's quite managed. Now, there are kind of strict regulations, and you sanitize your hands before going in, and you can
Yeah.
sanitize your basket or your trolley before going in
Hmm.
as well. There's often a queue with 2 meters social distance, so 6 feet or 6.5 feet, whatever it is,
Yeah.
social distance between people in the line, and one person at a time. I don't think I've really seen more than one person going to the shops at a time, and I've reduced how often I go as well. So I would only go
Hmm.
once a week now, if even.
Yeah.
But I do try and get out for either a walk or a run every day, and just so I get outside of the house.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you. It's amazing how that fresh outdoor air, really from a mental health perspective, makes all the difference.
Yeah.
I'm with you. We're entering rainy season, so the weather has not been overly cooperative. So I've
Okay.
had to learn to, get more comfortable of just getting wet and using an umbrella or whatever, just to maintain a
Okay.
sense of exercise, if
Yeah.
you will, during this time.
We've actually had fantastic, glorious weather in Ireland for almost every day for the last couple of months. Like it really has been amazing. And we have this kind of phenomenon in Ireland that we call the leaving cert weather. So the leaving cert is when it's the I suppose it's the SATs. It's like the leaving school examinations that we take.
Okay.
And there's this kind of phenomenon that when the leaving cert is on, the weather is really, really nice. And so we're calling this, it's like the leaving cert weather, but now it's become the lockdown weather because it's really, really nice in Ireland. And, it's never really, really nice all the time in Ireland. And now we can't really enjoy it as much as what we'd like to, unless you have a garden out the back, which I'm lucky to have. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. No, that's great that you guys are having great weather.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, back to the topic at hand.
Mhm.
We're talking about the future of work. So I'm really curious. You were saying that you've never been busier. So I suppose it'd be interesting to understand what kind of questions are people asking and what's the data showing?
Mm-hmm. So, as we think about pre-COVID, the future of work, what we were really looking at was the impact that accelerating technology advancements were having on the workforce. So it was very much technology driven. There was two signals, I would say, that we looked at. The first was the technology and the pace at which automation was happening and or augmentation to really change the way people worked and what they worked on. The second thing that we were looking at too, here in the States, we have the Business Roundtable. And for a while, the purpose of business has been around maximizing shareholder wealth to become as profitable as possible. And we were starting to see this narrative shift happen over the last couple years where people realized that if you continue to just solely focus on shareholder wealth, you were missing out on your stakeholders. So your employees, your suppliers, your vendors. And so we saw this shift in narrative happening around the purpose of business. And so again, we were tracking these things, we were doing research around these things, and they were slowly progressing, and as we thought about the future of work, we would imagine, we could see a time where the workforce was fully enabled to work remote and it would be kind of optional, more freedom and flexibility whether or not to come into the office. So it's been fascinating as someone who's been studying this future of work for almost 10 years now. It hit overnight. And so, when we get on the phone, I was just on the phone with a group of chief information officers and chief learning officers, and what they had to do, what their plan was to do over the next several years. In some cases, they did over a weekend. In
Wow.
others, it took a couple weeks. And so the future of work has emerged today, whether people were ready for it or not. And those same two trends, that acceleration of technology that's enabled a workforce to work remote, that maybe, on the negative side, displacing, work in jobs, that rate of automation has really started to accelerate. But at the same time, on the positive end, this need to work differently and reimagine the way that we do work has emerged. And so this need to be creative and innovative and really figure out new ways to serve your customers when they can't leave their house has really fueled a lot of need for technology and innovation and job creation in that area. And then the second thing, because of COVID and this being really a health crisis and a human crisis, the way that businesses respond now is really, I think under a limelight, and people are looking for how are they going to be, reopening their businesses, re-entering workers back into their physical offices. To what level, have they had safety protocols? And so I think companies and brands are getting examined under that level, which we knew this was going to start happening, but I think that's accelerated again almost overnight. And it'll be very interesting to see as companies emerge, as we think about the future of work and who's able to sustain this really major crisis. I think a lot in part is going to be their ability to have adapted to the technology and enable both customers and employees to access their product or service or knowledge through technology platforms. And then second, making sure they've got that broader stakeholder view and that they're not putting people's health at risk in order to reopen.
Yeah. And I've seen, I suppose, both sides of it, where people are trying to get back to normal much more quickly. But it's really important that we don't jeopardize people's health, and that there's no kind of pressure, and it's managing that balance and managing the message as well about what's going on.
Yes.
So you were saying, in terms of research and things, is there specific data that's come out that you're able to share with us today, around anything that's happened, in the last couple of months?
Yeah, great question. So right now we've got a couple data sources, research projects, I should say, in motion. So we've been pulsing the workforce every couple of weeks to just understand, again, do they plan on returning back to work if they are working remotely? What is their trust with their employer? Really just overall trying to get employee sentiment analysis during this time, because we do think this is going to be a fundamental shift and things will never quite go back to the way that they were. And I think in some ways what I'm seeing from the data is that's an okay thing, because I think there's an opportunity to bring more humanity back into the way that we think about work. But a couple things that I see emerging from the data. Number one, people are struggling with the transition to work remote. So if you before had, already worked from home, well over 70% of people have established a strong routine of how they work and norms. If you hadn't worked from home before and now you're working from home, that number is like less than 50% have figured out what their routine is going to look like and
Okay.
how they're going to establish a work from home routine. And so no surprise, what we're seeing within the data are those same people are struggling with digital overload, burnout, really trying to understand how many hours am I supposed to be working? How do I work, and collaborate? Not just that, what we're also seeing within that population who is kind of forced overnight to go work from home is over 70% are reporting on a high loneliness. So missing that social interaction that they have from the workplace and trying to figure out what does that look like and how do they get that. People who've already worked remote, we don't see that same spike in the numbers as it relates to a lack of routine, missing the social interaction and loneliness. And so I think one of the most important things from, that I see emerging within the data is leaders really need to help their workers transition to what we're calling at Accenture the never normal, and help them sustain this pace. We're seeing a lot of need for rest and recovery. A lot of people have not taken their PTO or, because there's no vacation to go on, there's nowhere to go. And
Yeah.
so we're seeing this buildup of people. One of the most important things as we think about high performance is rest and recovery. And so what does rest and recovery look like when you still have to stay at home, but you need to take that day or two off and disconnect from work. So those are some of the interesting things, that we're just seeing from an employee perspective. From a leadership perspective, we're seeing some really interesting things emerge. Two things, I looked at a data set. We were able to collect over 3,200 global executives right before the crisis hit, and then almost 16,000 workers. And we really analyzed what are the most important needs people have when they walk into the workplace. Like what's going to make them as healthy and productive as possible. No surprise, that follows Maslow's hierarchy of needs, very similar. You need to have physical needs. So whether do I feel safe and secure? And there's a sense of stability of pay in that. The second thing was a sense of mental needs. So whether or not I feel emotionally and mentally healthy when I come to the workplace, do I feel a sense of psychological safety and bringing my whole self to work? And then the third thing was relational. Brene Brown talks a lot about us being wired for connection. We're social beings, and work is a great example of that. So as you think through COVID has hit every one of those needs square on. So one of the things that we're trying to look at is, as a leader, how do I help navigate my workforce who's struggling with the base level physical, with their mental, and then also their relational needs? And we found two things that we ran a pretty complex statistical model. We threw in a bunch of variables and to try to figure out what matters most right now. And the two things that leaders have to get right, on one side of the coin, is compassion. People right now are desperately looking for people to be empathetic, to meet them at their very human need. I still see a lot of leaders coming into meetings, going right into the business. Here's our agenda. It's almost as like they haven't missed a beat.
Yeah.
And it's really important to take that step back and check in on the person and where they are. But then on the other side of the coin, people are desperately looking for a sense of confidence and a sense of that you as a leader have the capabilities to navigate us into the future, and that we're going to, that there's going to be a sense of transparency. Where are we struggling, and where do we need to leverage our strengths and be confident that we can navigate this? So that's what we've been spending a lot of time right now, is advising leaders. how do you make sure you lead with confidence plus compassion? And when you do that, we're seeing within the data anyways, trust and well-being really emerge within people's physical, emotional, and relational needs.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's so much there that I'd love
Yeah.
to drill into, like this really such an interesting statistic about and maybe one that I hadn't really thought about, this idea that there are some people, because I've always been in roles where I worked with a laptop and I was able to work from home maybe one day a week at least,
Yeah.
and hadn't really considered there are some people who just have never worked from home, and that those people are really, really struggling with finding a routine and getting kind of finding their feet, I suppose, even after 2 months. So that's very interesting. This whole idea of loneliness, that's definitely something that I can relate to, and it goes back to this, I suppose, the mental, the psychological need for connection that you mentioned as well, that you need to feel connected with people. And if you're living on your own, or if you're feeling very isolated, and you don't really know what to do about it, and you're struggling with the technology as well, and it's I suppose it's really, really hard to find that connection. And one thing that I'm trying to do a lot is to reach out to friends, whether it's on my mobile, whether it's having a Zoom call, whether it's in the evening or during the day. I'm going to kind of virtual coffee mornings and things like that to connect with other people, which is, it's really nice, and I think it's really needed, kind of at least once a day.
Yes.
I like this idea of the never normal, because people are calling it the new normal. They're talking about going back to normal, and it's like things are they're never going to be the same again after this. The idea of rest and recovery. Do you have any thoughts around what people can do to rest and recover? I mentioned kind of at the start of the podcast, I like to go out for a bit of exercise, to get outside, but I do find it a bit of a struggle. The laptop's there.
Mm-hmm.
I can easily turn it on at the weekend. In the evenings, I work for myself, so it's not a big deal. Any thoughts on what people could actually do?
Yeah, and I think this is where I think discipline becomes really important, because before we had that physical separation from our jobs and our work, in our home life. And yes, that was still, we saw the bleed from mobile technology still spilling over, but for the majority of the workforce, there was some level of physical separation between office life and home life. And now that's blurred in a way that's never physically, in terms of a space, never been more present. So I think there's a couple of things. One, and now some of this is going to depend on everyone's physical space they have at home. For those who are fortunate enough to carve out some separate space where that just becomes a workspace, again, that's going to be a luxury and privilege for many people, but those who can afford that, that is going to become so important, where that designated space in the house is simply meant for work. And so when you come in and when you go out, that starts to become that invisible boundary. But the second thing is, it's surprising the power of just micro breaks and being able to separate for that 5 to 10 minutes when you've been sitting on Zoom call after Zoom call from just a cognitive load that is very exhausting. And you wouldn't necessarily always do that in an office. You would get up and go to the water cooler, or you would go take a break, and we don't have those natural organic built-in breaks anymore, again, from a physical space. So it's being very disciplined to ensure that if you've been sitting for a few hours during your day or back to back with calls, you've got to get up and leave the space, and you've got to your point, even go outside if safe and you're able to, or just do something away from the screen. The screen time has gone up tremendously. And what I'm concerned about is you see a lot of people working extra long on their laptops, and then they're so exhausted. So what do? They go and turn on TV.
Of course. What else?
There's nothing. It's exactly. So we're just, again, there's this like lack of screen time break. And that's one of the best ways to feel energized. One of my friends studies this quite a bit in Canada. And she has said, it's amazing. If you want to feel energy right away, turn off all screens. And it's just amazing. Your brain starts to reset and kind of engage back into the natural world. And you start to get that spike in energy. So I do think it's being disciplined in finding those micro breaks to turn on the laptop. And as much as possible, and Accenture is actually doing a good job of this with us as a workforce, of mandatory, like you've got to take your PTO, you've got to take a day or two off where we're shutting down. You need that full reset. And yes, it's going to be a little depressing at times because there's nowhere to go. But but just that disconnection and detachment from work is
Yeah.
so powerful right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, it's kind of, I suppose that another extreme there is the people who would have been kind of quite workaholic previously. Now it's a fantastic opportunity for them to continue and continue. You know, they're like, well, you know, I may as well work, or I have to work,
Yep.
or whatever it is that, you know, whatever their reason, whatever their drive is to keep working, it's the perfect opportunity to be able to do that. And it makes it really, really difficult then to switch off.
Yes. And, you know, I think it depends on the type of work that's being done too. So this has been something we've been trying to look a lot at. You know, is during times of crisis or, you know, some sort of constriction, it only leaves room for the essentials to emerge. You know, and so it's fascinating to actually look at all the non-essential work that we've just built up because of bureaucracy or matrix environments or just business administration.
Yeah.
And you start to realize, you know, I did a TED talk on this last year that, you know, an anthropologist has called this soulless work. I mean, it's not very human work, and it actually drains us and doesn't necessarily bring, you know, a strong sense of meaning to our lives. And so I do think this is a time to really reset the button on what it means to work, and really examine what are those tasks and what is the end outcome. We're seeing purpose emerge again as what is the very purpose of our existence as a business, and what is it that we're trying to achieve and add value to. And so I think if you can maintain a sense of intellectual stimulation and meaningful connection during this time, you know, I'm a little less concerned, you know, by if you are, you know, jumping into more of that workaholic mode. But if you're jumping into that workaholic mode and you're devoid of that meaningful connection, you're devoid of that, you know, sense of purpose behind it, and really not having any sort of learning or intellectual stimulation occurring, and you're just kind of sitting there robotic, I think that's going to be a really alarming issue.
Yeah.
And it's no surprise we're seeing a lot of mental health occur as a result of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'll come back to the mental health in a minute. I was on a people analytics conference call yesterday, which was
Yeah.
quite interesting. And they had someone from a UK charity talking about mental health and the spike in mental health issues, and, you know, people needing, so many more people needing their support recently, like hugely, hugely. I wanted to pick up on this whole idea of the essentials, and it, for me, it really ties in with this, you know, what you were kind of saying about we've built the way we work around all these meaningless tasks that really, you know, a report for the sake of a report that no one's ever going to read. You know, and I spoke to someone on the podcast a couple of weeks ago in relation to, he calls it bullshit jobs. There's a book called Bullshit Jobs.
Yep.
All of these jobs that basically you don't really need them. And I think that's what's happening now. We're going back to the essential of what we actually do. What does it mean to work? What is our purpose as a business? What is it that we're trying to achieve here? Are you seeing that kind of translating into reality then for the businesses that you work with?
Yes, I think it's funny. I was on the phone call this week with our media team, you know, who does scans to kind of see what's emerging within this space. And the number one conversation that we see emerging is around purpose and, you know, kind of what is everyone's core purpose, and how do we actually stay true to that, even in the midst of a crisis. So yeah, I mean, I think it's very profound. I've read Bullshit Jobs, too. It's a great, again, the anthropologist look at what's happening. And I think it's really important, you know, as someone who, I study a lot of business history because I'm always fascinated of how did we get to where we are today, you know, and, you know, as we look at this, a lot of people call it an engagement problem, but, you know, people are just not, I call it more of a meaning problem, just don't have meaning or connection to what it is that they do every day. And that just leads to profound disconnect in our personal lives. And so when I look at how we kind of got to the work design we are, I mean, it was built around the assumption, two core assumptions. One is that people don't want to work, and so they have to be managed, and that there's an inherent disconnect between work and leisure time. And if given the choice, people would just want to engage in a whole bunch of leisure time. And so we've created this really micromanaging, process-oriented leadership styles to ensure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that, quite frankly, people are intelligent on their own. And then the second thing is we've really set the North Star towards efficiency. So, you know, in order to scale, we have to become as efficient as possible. And so those have kind of become our North Stars, that, hey, people don't really want to be at the company anyways. There's an inherent disconnect between their interest and the company's interest, and everything we do has to be so that it becomes efficient. And so fast forward to now we're in 2020, and those ideas have allowed us to become really great at production and producing things,
Mm.
but maybe not so good at actually creating societal value at large and solve some of our most complex problems.
Yeah.
And so I do think this is a tremendous opportunity to really reset those norms and reset those assumptions. As we've seen, people have actually become more productive, not less productive, with the less oversight that they have now working from home. Like people
Mm.
inherently want to work and need to contribute something. And then the second thing is we've got to figure out, instead of figuring out efficiency, we've really done a great job as a human race on nailing that one. How do we actually think about how do we become more creative and more innovative and better learners and better co-creators with our environment? And this, that to me is, I think, what's going to be most exciting coming from all of this is I'm seeing businesses have a digging much deeper into these, constructs or ideas than before COVID hit.
Brilliant. Yeah. So it's like maybe they were going that way anyway, but this has kind of accelerated that whole process.
Absolutely.
So this idea of how we are adding value and yeah, how, what is it that you're doing? And I loved what you said about, people, if you leave them on their own, they're going to get on with it. It's this whole,
Yes.
you don't need to be told what to do and how to do it. You need to be shown what, I love that you said the North Star. You need to be shown what the North Star is and let
Yep.
people get on with it. And if up to now the North Star has been driving efficiency, and I'm probably guilty of that myself, like how much did you get done and
Right.
what did you, how many things did you tick off your task list? But actually, what's the purpose behind that? What's that driving me towards? Like, what's the benefit to society, or what's the benefit to me of doing these things?
Yes.
Really, really interesting.
Yep. Absolutely.
And becoming, so we've been great at becoming more productive. But how now are we going to make a contribution? And so that's from a company perspective, but I see the same thing happening from an individual perspective as well. People have more time to reflect on, like, what is my purpose in life? Not just what is the company purpose and vision and mission. It's what is my purpose, and does that align with that mission? Are you seeing that kind of coming out of the data as well, or is that something that you've looked at?
Yeah, great question. And it's actually something I started looking at before COVID hit. So, it was always fascinating to me as an individual, like, what is my purpose? What's my motivation to keep showing up every day to work? And it's interesting, usually when you ask people that, like just randomly ask people on the streets, the answer 9 out of 10 times was, well, to get a paycheck, to make
Yeah.
money, so I can have a standard of living. But it was so interesting when I'd ask in a survey data, anonymously, like, what motivates you to go above and beyond, or what would motivate you to come in an hour early and really work on something? Rarely it was for money or anything extrinsic. It was much more around, well, I would do that if I knew I was helping someone. We started hearing words like helping,
Yeah.
or, if I knew I was doing good or I was going to add value. And so I was seeing this right before COVID hit in the data set and starting to think about, maybe as individuals, we really don't know ourselves at work as well as we think we do. And we've been a little bit trained from our maybe over rotation on economic terms and, the economy to think about everything in terms of transactional value and dollars and cents here in the States. And so I do think now, because exactly what you've said, people have had some time for reflection, and purpose and meaning matter, I think, more than ever. And especially if you're going to be stuck at home and you're not going to have some of those office perks that you had before of going in and doing these things, you've really got to make sure that what you're doing, you've got to see that connection to how it's helping someone else and adding value. And so I think companies have a tremendous opportunity now to bridge that gap through communications and really through anchoring people back to what it is and why we have to be doing what we're doing right now in these uncomfortable conditions. And those companies that have anchored back to their overall purpose, in some cases here in the States, I was just on the phone with an automotive company, and they quickly transitioned from making cars and trucks to ventilators and masks, and just
Wow.
being able to rally around that purpose at the individual level of, hey, we're going to transition your job overnight, and you're going to immediately start to see the impact it's having, has been tremendous. And I think it's brought a lot more meaning to their jobs.
Wow. And, I suppose, I don't know, is this kind of more on a personal opinion note, but do you think then that there are some companies that maybe I don't want to say that they don't have a purpose, but maybe that their purpose is less clear, or it you know, maybe it ties in with this bullshit job things where actually, you know, there's no reason for that company to exist other than for kind of very what's the word I'm looking for, very kind of superficial reasons, I suppose.
Yes, I think it's funny when I think about like the financial crisis. I think that exposed some of that in '07, '08 of some of the the middle intermediaries that were just simply just transferring money or transferring paper that really actually maybe not. I love that word, superficial. Really wasn't adding necessarily any value at a customer level. I actually think we're going to be, again, looking deeply across all of our industries. Again, going back to if you anchor back to the customer and whether or not the customer is healthier, or whether or not the customer is having an increased standard of life because of what you're doing, whether it's the knowledge or the service or the product you're creating, that should tend to keep you crisis proof to some degree, and continue to keep your North Star in the right direction. I think it's times when where the crisis illuminates is exactly what you're saying is, one, if you've been founded on a superficial purpose, if it's truly just been to make money, especially at the expense of people or at the expense of customers, that's going to get exposed during times like this. And I think that's okay. And I would just encourage, people and workers at the individual level who don't have that meaning or that connection or aren't sure what their purpose is of their company is to ask, and ask and press a bit. And if it's not aligned to their own individual values, then this would be a great time to start looking to look for those companies, because it's very obvious those companies who are leading with purpose and have been able to maintain a sense of steadiness during this crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you said about values. I'll come back to that in a second, but I wanted to kind of highlight this whole idea of transactional value. So I got a message from a friend during the week, and it was something like, oh, well, I've done my hours. I've built up my hours over the week, so it's okay if I take a half day today, or something like this. So to me, that is very transactional, and it's not focusing on, I immediately picked up on that. Maybe it's over the last couple of years, I've become more aware of that kind of thing. It's the money in exchange for time, as opposed to money in exchange for the results that you're producing as an individual. And it really hit home when she said that it was like, oh, I've built up my hours during the week, so it's okay if I take a half day. And I just thought, wow, like that's the epitome of trading time for money, and of this whole transactional nature of work, when actually it's really about the results that you produce. I love what you've said about really focusing on the customer. And if you're not adding value to the customer, then those companies are just going to disappear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's, again, taking a bit of a historical lens. I think because so much of our business and our management philosophies have arisen much more from an engineering, perspective, an economic perspective. So we're really good at making those trade-off decisions, to your point. And it's simple. I mean, at the end of the day, and it's sustained so long because it's simple. Our minds can get around it, and it almost like creates this equality because we all either have a certain amount of time. But what I'm really hoping is that we can begin to tell ourselves a new narrative and maybe draw from other disciplines. So I'm doing a lot of studying right now in physics and biology, and trying to understand how living things work and sustain over time, as opposed to mechanical things, which, again, we've built everything based on an assembly line in manufacturing and really not non-human traits. And so unfortunately, those non-human traits and attributes have carried over into the way that we see ourselves and the way that we treat each other in the workplace. And so, one of the things that I'm hopeful on, and I think this is going to take a little bit of time, is forming that new narrative. So, I mean, we still need to anchor back to some sort of analogy or trade-off, but is there a better way we can be doing it as opposed to just economic and industrial terminology?
Yeah. And what are you seeing so far then? I mean, that's a fascinating area to look at.
Yes. I've actually been surprised that I haven't seen a lot of this intersection yet of taking these disciplines into business and the way that we think about business. And I think maybe because they're a bit abstract and they're hard to measure. But a couple of things, one of the things that I'm focusing a lot right now on that looking at physics is flow. So flow, they do a lot of measuring flow. And one of the questions is, what is it that we're actually trying to flow through our organizations? Is it knowledge? Is it people? Is it money? And I think once we can actually start to really think about that flow throughout organizations and think about as more of a living system, I think it's going to illuminate a lot of tendencies that we have to block flow. And, and one of the things that may sound abstract, but I think one of the things that we never think about, and maybe because it's too philosophical, is how does the human spirit flow through our organizations and our human traits? How does that, whether it's joy or meaning or collaboration, those very human traits, how do we actually do those things? And one of the things I've done just to ground it in something real, I was having an issue in my current job with a team. One of us was either feeling out of the loop, or, you start to, especially as you start to get isolated working from home, it just felt like there wasn't this knowledge sharing. And so I took a step back and thought, okay, because it starts to then become a personality issue, because you start to become more contentious on phone calls, and you start to assume negative intent of the, the team or the person. And so as I started reading this physics, I was thinking to myself, oh my goodness, one of the things that what feels blocked right now is that flow of knowledge, because we're no longer working together and it feels secretive. And so I was like, okay, how would you fix that? Well, you start meeting with the people on a regular basis. I mean, we didn't have one-on-ones established solely for the purpose of getting to know each other and getting to actually build social capital and relational capital with each other. And it's been amazing. Yes, it's taken a lot more time from a calendar perspective, but the flow of knowledge, information now, and just positive intent seems to be flowing at all cylinders. So it's taking that time to really assess, like at a human level, what's happening here, and how do we kind of go back to kindness and kind of compassion that we know work to help so work becomes just better and much more meaningful for on both sides now.
Yeah, that's brilliant that you can take these kind of practical steps. And I love that throughout our conversation, you've kind of suggested some very practical things that people can do to implement stuff. I want to go back now to the values piece that you kind of touched on at the start, because that forms part of what I'm researching for my dissertation at the moment, is values and how values contributes to our sense of fit. And I use the term fit meaning a match, as opposed to like molding yourself to fit in. It's more like being able to be yourself at work and still feel, satisfied and engaged, and all of those kind of things. And values is a really crucial element, as is needs satisfaction that you had mentioned earlier. And so I'd love to drill into that in a little bit more detail, and anything that you have to share about values.
Yeah, it's values is another underrepresented topic, I would say, in applied research. So, I think from an academic perspective, I see a lot of articles on it, and I think it's so important. But then when it comes to the applied side, for whatever reason, we don't, maybe we talk a bit about company mission or purpose, but when it starts getting to values, maybe on a website you can find 5 or 6 values, but they tend not to actually be operationalized.
But there's it's what's on the website, what's on the what's painted on the walls, and what's in your email signature, but actually operationalized. I like that. Totally. Yeah. It's not reflected in the behavior of what's happening on a day-to-day basis in the offices.
Exactly. And I think that's, again, to kind of draw from some physics, physics helps us explain the invisible of what's kind of happening, that, that drives action or drives force. And I think values is one of those things that are the invisible that actually make the organization work or not work. And I think sometimes when leaders ask, well, how do I know what people value? Or, how do I actually know, what our company's values are? Every day, those are emergent in my mind. So, the values, hopefully at an individual level, core values remain stable. But the way that they're expressed really is emergent depending on the culture and the environment and the way that people lead and behave. And so, again, when I think through a crisis mode, this is where we start to see this, essential, stable values that we have to keep going back to. So it's really easy to start, like I was saying before, get competitive or feel a sense of negative intent from people. But we know it, like I know at Accenture, we value collaboration. Like that is one of our core values. And it's having to constantly go back to that in our behaviors. And it has to become very intentional. These values just don't occur because you have a lot of people who value collaboration. You've got to provide the right infrastructure and conditions by which they can exist. And so that's the other thing I think right now we can really go through. I'll get another practical example here is performance management. A lot of times performance management is wired for competition and at the individual level. So we assess people at the end of the year based on a metric or their individual output. But yet then we say we value collaboration and making people around us better. Those two things are inherently disconnected from the way we're actually managing and paying people. So I think any sort of congruence that we can have with values and then the systems that we design within our organizations is going to be instrumental if we actually want to have them become visible on a daily basis.
And what's the answer there in relation to performance management?
Yeah, so I think there's a great example. Microsoft is one that I've studied a lot in depth, and I think because they had this very individualistic engineering type culture, and were struggling, during 2000s to compete with, all the rising tech that was emerging within Silicon Valley. And so the CEO, I give him so much credit, decided to take a look at all the, people practices within the organization to figure out, okay, we've got the intellectual capital here. That's going to only go so far until we can build that social capital to actually make it all work together within a system. And so he went ahead and, with his team, redesigned performance management by adding one question that changed everything, and which was around, how do you make others around you better? So instead of just focusing on your individual output every year, hey, I made X amount of widgets in X amount of time, I want to get into a different conversation. How is your presence here within the firm or within the system making others around you better? And so if those other people around you are better, it's going to spread in domino effect throughout the organization, where your individual output might only have this particular influence. And that rapidly changed the culture and the way that people interacted. Because if you start incentivizing people to make others around them better, which is actually a very inherent human quality anyways, it has perfect alignment between what we inherently as humans tend to value. We're much more of a collaborative species than a competitive species. And so that's just one example of actually the way that we assess and measure. Just changing the questions and the focus makes a big change.
To me, that's a game changer. It
Mm-hmm.
really is. How do you make others around you better?
It is something and it's like something you even ask in your personal life and professional life. It's just a different frame. And again, it just connects, as someone who studies meaning all the time, it just makes that connection to meaning so much better, because that I know that's what drives meaning. We know it's helping people. And if we can line that in the way that we think about ourselves, I think it's just leads to better workplaces.
I was about to say, so on the one hand, it's how you make meaning of how you make other people better around you, but also it helps you to find that sense of purpose. Like, how would you like to help other people around you? And I often ask people, like, what's the problem that you see in the world? What's wrong with the world that you would like to fix? And for me, it's workplaces. It's creating happier workplaces. I think in a lot of situations, work is broken. What you were saying earlier about it's people aren't happy at work, people are unproductive, they're focusing on efficiency, all of this kind of stuff. It's so, to me, that's what I think in the world needs to be fixed. And how I would like to make things better is by solving that problem.
Yes, I
one at a time.
could be more aligned. Exactly. Mine is probably a bit more about making workplaces or just work itself more meaningful. But yeah, it's same thing. I mean, I think that's a huge, and if we can fix that problem, I think the domino effect across other societal problems that emerge because our workplaces are so broken would start to dissipate.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree. So Kelly, just conscious of time here, is there anything else that you would like to share, anything that hasn't been covered, or any kind of practical tips that you'd like to leave people with?
I think the only thing that I would say just in closing on this conversation is, we focus a lot on others, but I think during this time to remind ourselves that as humans, we do have our own limitations on what we can navigate and tackle. And I've done some work before. It was a piece actually called "Does Scarcity Make You Dumb?" And it's just around the cognitive overload we all have when we're faced with an unmet urgent need. And so I think this is an opportunity. We are all cognitively overloaded. To your point, like we talked about earlier, just trying to get to the grocery store just takes so much more time and fear. And instead of turning inward during this time, I think this could be a tremendous opportunity for us to all share in our shared human condition. We all are facing some sort of scarcity. And how do we actually connect, whether that's, again, the framework at the beginning, physical, emotional, relational, where are we struggling and where can we extend the bridge for the others struggling? I think, again, this could really unite us in a way that we haven't had the opportunity before. The last time we've seen this level was kind of, when I do my research, was around World War II.
Wow.
And the world felt like it was, obviously on fire. And as a result, we saw this level of collaboration and unity and a sense of meaning and purpose. And I I used to say before this happened, it would take a crisis for us to get to this point again, to really reset work and reset our norms.
Yeah.
And so I'm just hopeful people will take this opportunity to really re-examine and reset in areas
Yeah.
so that it brings shared humanity forward.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with everything you've said. How do you think that we could do that? Is that really having conversations like this, sharing on social media, reaching out to neighbors, reaching out to community, and reaching out to friends? Is that at the heart of what it is that you're trying to say?
Yeah, I think, and again, to keep going back to like quantum physics and biology, where change happens is always at the localized level. And so I think in some ways, even myself, I've over rotated on trying to change systems, these massive systems, and change the world. Instead, if we can understand the effect it would have, if we just started to change within our control, our sphere of influence, the local environment by which we exist, it would create change at scale. And so I think in some ways, I'm having a big reframe. Instead of trying to change the big system, which really could never be done in my lifetime, I can start changing local communities. And that is my local neighborhood, my family, friends. You start to think through that ecosystem. And if I can start enacting everything that I preach on a day-to-day basis on how to make work more meaningful, I think that's where we actually see the change that we might not even be aware of. And so I'm really kind of calling on more of a localized change now, and keep our heads up and see. You create localized change in Ireland, I create localized change in Philly. We have these conversations and connect,
Yeah.
and hopefully encourage and bring visibility to that. And then over time, I think we begin to see a new narrative form.
Brilliant. I love that approach because I'm similar. I'm like, but I want to change the whole world, and I want it to do it tomorrow. I want
Yeah.
everything to happen immediately. But yeah, and I'm starting to see the impact of taking small steps as well. Like
Yes.
that's something that's really, really come to light for me in the last, probably in around the last year, because I'm very much, I take these giant leaps. I take
Yes.
on big projects. I do huge things. I traveled for 6 months at a time. I
Yeah.
do things big, basically.
Yes.
But I am starting to see the benefit of taking the small steps. And this
Yeah.
localized approach, I really, really love that. And just
Yeah.
having that impact on friends and family. And again, kind of bringing it back to a personal level, I was texting with a friend of mine and she's struggling a little bit in work. She has no meaning in work, basically. And we were trying to kind of establish, based on her personality, what might she find fulfillment in? And, it would take too long to get there. And, and I said, well, the time would pass anyway.
Yeah.
So you're going to get there either way. Either you're there in 4 years' time, still in the same job, miserable,
Yep.
or you've invested that 4 years wisely, and you feel more meaning and fulfillment because you're investing the time in getting to where it is that you want to go to.
Absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant. So Kelly, the question I ask everyone who comes onto the podcast: what makes you happier at work?
Yeah, so for me personally, this is more of my own individual difference. I love learning. So anytime that I come to work and I'm engaged in some sort of learning activity, now that could be at a very micro level where it's a new technology or new way to do something, or for me too, I mean, I'm having a lot of learning just in terms of paradigm shifts, or really seeing where again, as humans, we're biased, and, I manage a team, and you kind of ascribe a particular trait to someone, or you think they're a certain way, and then they just blow through that paradigm, and you realize, they're obviously so much more capable than you could ever imagine. Like that to me makes me very happy. And every day, if I can learn something, I feel fulfilled and I feel happy. It's the days that I come in and I haven't learned anything and I'm just pushing paper around, where you start to realize you're not so happy in that environment. So that's for me
Yeah.
personally what makes me happy.
Yeah. No, learning is one of my core values as well. I
Yeah.
absolutely love learning. And when I finish the master's, I'm sure I'll find something else that I can continue and study. But like that, whether it's a new technology or whether it's a new way of doing things or anything like that, I really, really like absorbing knowledge. And not only that, but sharing knowledge.
Yes.
It's always been kind of a passion of mine. Brilliant. So if people want to reach out to you, what's the best way they can do that? And feel free to mention any kind of webinars that are coming up, or any events or anything like that that you'd like to mention.
Yeah, I've got a couple things. So I actually, just speaking of learning, over COVID taught myself how to, just build a small website. So I'm trying to consolidate all my research and podcast and events on that. It's called let me make sure I get the URL right, thebigworkplacereset.com. So it's all about how do we actually reset work, and we'll love to include a link to your podcast on that as well. But yep, that's the bigworkplacereset.com. I also house a lot of things on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn. By all means, please connect and reach out. And then on our Accenture.com site, we've got a lot of great research that we use, really COVID specific right now, some of that practical action, depending on if you're a business or leader, what you may need. So those are the 3 places to really find me.
Brilliant. That's great. Thanks so much. I'll definitely check out the website. And
yes, you'll probably be one of my first visitors. So like, this is my first launch. So if you see anything wrong, please let me know. It's a work in motion.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because what I am realizing about myself is I love finding errors. I love finding the detail of stuff and being like, okay, that's not right. It needs to change.
Yes. Well, I'm sure this could be a playground for you then.
Whether it's grammar, whether it's spelling, whether it's, on a project or something like that. But yeah, I just love finding those little detail things of being like, oh, that I need to change that. And,
yes.
And it's not in a bad way. It's more in a, that gives me a buzz being able to find those little kind of.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. That's wonderful. Well, if you have any feedback, please let me know.
Absolutely. Yeah, will do. Yeah. But that's brilliant. I so much enjoyed our conversation.
Me too.
I could have chatted for hours here about the future of work, or, what the immediate crisis means for us at the moment. But yeah, really, really thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much. And I swear, I hope I can get to Ireland. That trip is like in 2021 for me now. So when I do, I have to make sure that we go up and meet for some coffee or something when I make it there.
Yeah, definitely would love to do that. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you so much. It was great meeting you. Take care.